We are forever in your debt, mountain man. For this kindness, I offer you the loyalty of my 500 finest warriors.
Blood on pristine snow tells a story words never could. In the bitter winter of 1864, the Mogollon Mountains froze solid, burying men and beasts alike. But what solitary trapper Rowan Coulter found dying in a wind-carved cave wasn't just a mother and child, it was the spark that would ignite a legend. The New Mexico Territory was an unforgiving mistress, and in the winter of 1864, she was feeling particularly cruel. The locals called it a blue norther, a sudden, violent plunge in temperature, accompanied by a blinding wall of snow that could freeze a man mid-stride. Rowan Coulter, a man carved from the very granite of the Gila wilderness, was checking his final snare line near Whitewater Creek when the storm hit. Rowan was a mountain man in the truest sense. At 38, he wore the scars of a grisly attack on his left shoulder and the quiet, heavy sorrow of a man who had seen too much blood in the Mexican-American War. He lived alone in a fortified log cabin perched on a ridgeline, trading beaver pelts and deer hides down at Pinos Altos only when necessity demanded it. He preferred the company of the whispering pines to the deceitful tongues of men. The wind howled like a wounded wolf as Rowan trudged through knee-deep drifts, his Henry rifle slung over his heavy buffalo coat. Visibility was dropping to mere feet. That was when he heard it, a sound completely out of place in the roaring tempest. It was a thin, high-pitched whimper. At first he thought it was a dying coyote pup. Drawing his hunting knife, Rowan pushed through a thicket of snow-laden junipers and found himself staring into the mouth of a shallow limestone cave. The sight inside stopped the breath in his chest. Huddled against the frozen rock was a woman. She was Apache, her traditional buckskin dress tattered and soaked through. In her arms, clutched with the desperate, white-knuckled grip of a dying mother, was a young boy no older than 4. They were emaciated, their cheekbones pressing sharply against their wind-burned skin. The fire they had tried to build was nothing but a pile of cold, black ash. In these mountains, the unwritten law was brutal and clear. Apaches and white men killed each other on sight. Decades of broken treaties, scalp bounties, and vengeance had stained the soil red. By all the rules of the frontier, Rowan should have walked away. Let the winter do what the cavalry had been trying to do for years. But as the woman slowly lifted her head, Rowan didn't see an enemy. He saw a pair of dark, terrified eyes burning with the last embers of human endurance. She didn't plead. She simply tightened her grip on her boy, bracing for the blade she assumed was coming. "Damn it all to hell," Rowan muttered into his frost-crusted beard. He holstered his knife and unshouldered his heavy buffalo hide coat. The woman flinched as he stepped closer, but Rowan moved with slow, deliberate calmness. He knelt, wrapping the massive, warm hide around both her and the child. The boy, who Rowan later learned was named Dawson, was entirely limp, his lips tinted a terrifying shade of blue. Rowan knew they wouldn't survive the 2-mile trek if they walked. He gathered the woman and the boy into his arms, hoisting them against his chest. They were shockingly light, nothing but bone and fading spirit. With the wind screaming in his ears and the snow blinding his path, Rowan began the agonizing climb back to his cabin. The journey took hours. Rowan's legs burned, his lungs seared with the sub-zero air, and his hands grew numb. When he finally kicked open the heavy oak door of his cabin, he collapsed onto the floorboards, the mother and child tumbling safely onto a pile of bear rugs. Rowan moved frantically. He stoked the dying embers in the stone hearth until a roaring fire pushed the cold back into the corners of the room. He boiled snow for water, adding dried venison and wild onions to make a rich broth. For 3 days, the cabin was a purgatory hovering between life and death. Rowan spoon-fed the warm broth to the boy, drop by agonizing drop, while the mother lay shivering in a fever dream. When her fever finally broke on the 4th morning, she opened her eyes to find the towering, bearded, white man sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of cottonwood. She sat up violently, searching for her son. Dawson was sleeping peacefully on a cot, wrapped in wool blankets, his color returning. "Easy," Rowan said, keeping his voice low and raising his hands in a gesture of peace. He spoke a few words of broken Spanish, the trade language of the territory. Estás a salvo. You are safe. The woman stared at him, her chest heaving. Slowly, the realization washed over her. Her enemy had carried her through a blizzard and fed her child. Nalin, she whispered, her voice raspy and dry. She pointed to her chest. Nalin. Rowan, he replied, tapping his own chest. It was the beginning of a fragile truce. As the days bled into weeks, the blizzard kept them locked inside the cabin. Nalin proved to be a woman of quiet strength and sharp intellect. Once she regained her strength, she didn't sit idle. She took over the scraping and stretching of Rowan's furs, a task she performed with far more skill than he ever had. She mended his clothes, weaving intricate patterns with sinew. In return, Rowan treated them not as prisoners, but as honored guests. He built a small wooden horse for Dasan, and the sound of the boys' laughter echoing in the log cabin stirred something deep and dormant in Rowan's chest. For years, the silence of his home had been a comfort. Now, he dreaded the day the snows would melt and take the noise away. Through halting Spanish and hand signs, Nalin shared fragments of her story. Her band had been ambushed by Mexican scalp hunters south of the border. In the chaos, she and Dasan had been separated from her people, driven north into the unforgiving mountains with no supplies. What she didn't tell him not yet was the identity of her brother, a man whose name struck terror into the hearts of settlers across the Southwest. By early March, the brutal grip of winter began to loosen. The icicles clinging to the eaves of the cabin dripped steadily, and patches of brown earth began to peek through the blinding white. With the thaw came the blooming of a quiet, undeniable romance. It wasn't born of grand declarations or poetry. It was born of shared survival. It was in the way Rowan would ensure Nalin had the best cuts of meat. It was in the way Nalin would silently step behind Rowan and massage the lingering ache from his scarred shoulder after a long day of chopping wood. One evening, as the fire cast dancing shadows against the walls, Nalin reached out and gently traced the deep scar on his arm. Rowan looked at her, the rough, hardened edges of his soul softening under her dark, intense gaze. He took her hand, his calloused fingers interlacing with hers. In the quiet of the mountain, they found a sanctuary in one another. But the melting snow also opened the mountain passes, and the outside world was quick to intrude on their isolated paradise. Rowan was out back splitting firewood when his hunting dog, a hound mix named Buster, began to bark viciously toward the southern trail. Rowan dropped his axe and instinctively reached for the Henry rifle leaning against the chopping block. Riding up the muddy switchback were 3 men. Rowan recognized the leader immediately, and his blood ran cold. It was Caleb Higgins. Higgins was a notorious brute from Santa Rita, a man who made his living trading in whiskey, stolen horses, and, most lucratively, Apache scalps. The Chihuahua government was paying $200 for an adult male scalp and $100 for a woman's. To men like Higgins, Nalin, and Dasan weren't human. They were walking fortunes. Rowan moved quickly. He ducked into the cabin. Nalin, hide. The root cellar, now. Nalin saw the urgency in his eyes. She didn't ask questions. She grabbed Dasan, pressed a hand over his mouth to keep him quiet, and slipped beneath the heavy floorboards into the dark, earthen cellar. Rowan kicked an old rug over the trapdoor just as heavy fists pounded on the front door. "Coulter! Open up, you old badger!" Higgins's raspy voice boomed. Rowan cracked the door, keeping his rifle held casually but ready at his hip. "What do you want, Higgins? You're a long way from the gutters of Santa Rita." Higgins pushed the door wide, stepping into the cabin uninvited, his 2 lackeys hovering on the porch. Higgins smelled of stale sweat, cheap rye, and blood. "Storm caught us in the lower valley a few weeks back. Been tracking a stray squaw and a pup. Cut their sign down near Whitewater before the snow covered it. You see any savages sniffing around your traps?" "I don't see anything but pine trees and deer," Rowan lied smoothly. "You're wasting your time up here." Higgins's eyes darted around the cabin. He was a predator, always looking for weakness. His gaze stopped at the hearth. Hanging on the drying rack was a pair of small, beautifully beaded moccasins that Nalin had been making for Dasan. The air in the room seemed to freeze. "Ain't those a bit small for your feet, Coulter?" Higgins sneered, his hand dropping slowly toward the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "Looks like Apache stitching to me." "I took him off a body down south years ago," Rowan said, his muscles coiling like a spring. "Keep him as a souvenir." Higgins smirked, shaking his head. "You always were a terrible liar, Rowan." Without another word, Higgins drew his weapon. But Rowan was faster. Years of surviving the frontier had honed his reflexes to a razor's edge. Instead of raising the long rifle, which would take too long in the cramped space, Rowan drove the butt of the Henry hard into Higgins's chest, knocking the breath from his lungs and sending his shot wide into the ceiling. Before Higgins could recover, Rowan dropped the rifle, drew his heavy bowie knife, and lunged. The two men crashed into the dining table, splintering it to pieces. Higgins clawed at Rowan's eyes, desperately trying to bring his pistol to bear, but Rowan pinned the man's gun arm with his knee. With a guttural roar, Rowan drove the blade home. The two men on the porch, hearing the gunshot, rushed the door. Rowan ripped Higgins's revolver from his dying grip and fired twice from the floor. The first man caught a bullet in the throat and crumpled over the threshold. The second man, seeing his partners dead in a matter of seconds, scrambled backward off the porch, mounted his horse in a panic, and rode wildly back down the trail, disappearing into the timber. Rowan stood up, his chest heaving, the metallic scent of gunpowder filling the small cabin. He looked down and realized his heavy coat was soaked in blood. During the struggle, Higgins had managed to drag a hidden boot knife across Rowan's ribcage, a deep, jagged slash that was bleeding profusely. Rowan stumbled and fell hard against the wall, clutching his side. The trapdoor flew open. Nalin scrambled out, her eyes wide with panic as she took in the carnage. When she saw Rowan sliding down the wall, his face going pale, she rushed to him. "Rowan!" she cried out, her hands quickly pressing against the wound to staunch the flow of blood. She yelled something in Apache to Dasan, who obediently ran to fetch clean rags and boiling water from the hearth. As Rowan's vision began to blur at the edges, he looked up at Nalin. She wasn't trembling. Her face was set in a mask of fierce, unwavering determination. She stripped away his coat and shirt, applying pressure. She then gathered a pouch of herbs she had foraged yarrow and dried pine pitch, chewing them quickly to activate them before packing the deep wound to stop the bleeding and stave off infection. "You saved me," she whispered fiercely in Spanish, her hands stained with his blood. "Now, I save you." Rowan closed his eyes, the pain radiating through his body. But as he felt her gentle, desperate hands working to keep him tethered to the earth, he knew one thing for certain. His old life of quiet isolation was dead. He had spilled white blood for an Apache woman. The man who had fled down the mountain would talk. The storm outside was melting, but a much darker storm was heading straight for his door. The fever took Rowan on the second day. The deep gouge in his ribs from Higgins's blade was infected, the flesh turning an angry, mottled purple despite Nalin's best efforts with the pine pitch and yarrow. For 3 days and 3 nights, Rowan existed in a hallucinatory haze, trapped in the ghosts of his past. He muttered in delirium about the artillery fire at Chapultepec, the screams of dying men in the Mexican sun, and the heavy, suffocating guilt of surviving when better men had not. Through it all, Nalin was his anchor. She barely slept. She steeped willow bark in boiling water, forcing the bitter, pain-numbing tea down his throat drop by drop. She applied cool, damp cloths to his burning forehead and changed the dressings on his side with a gentle, steady hand. Dasan, sensing the gravity of the white man's illness, sat quietly by the hearth, keeping the fire fed with small sticks of kindling. When Rowan finally broke the fever on the morning of the 4th day, he awoke weak, drenched in sweat, but clear-headed. He turned his head and saw Nalin asleep in a chair beside his cot, her hand still loosely clutching his. He squeezed her fingers gently. She woke with a start, her dark eyes wide with alarm before softening into profound relief. "You returned," she whispered in Spanish, a weary smile touching her lips. "Couldn't leave," Rowan rasped, his throat feeling like sandpaper. "You're too terrible at making coffee. Had to show you how it's done." The joke was weak, but it earned a genuine, quiet laugh from her. It was the first time he had heard the sound, and it warmed the cold corners of the cabin better than the hearth ever could. But the warmth was fleeting. Rowan tried to sit up, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his teeth as his side protested. He swung his legs over the edge of the cot. "Rowan, no. You must rest," Nalin urged, pressing a hand to his uninjured shoulder. "No time," he grunted, forcing himself to his feet. He leaned heavily against the log wall, waiting for the dizziness to pass. That rat who ran. He didn't run to hide. He ran to Pinos Altos. Rowan was right. 30 miles south, in the booming, mud-streaked mining camp of Pinos Altos, Pete Banning, the sole survivor of Higgins's trio, had just kicked open the swinging doors of the Miners' Rest Saloon. Banning was a coward, but he possessed a venomous tongue. Over a glass of cheap rye, he spun a wildly fabricated tale to a captive audience of hardened prospectors, outlaws, and discharged soldiers. He didn't mention that Higgins had attempted to murder Rowan for scalp money. Instead, Banning claimed they had stopped at Coulter's cabin seeking shelter from the thaw, only to find the mountain man had gone Injun. He told the crowd that Rowan had taken an Apache squaw as a wife, turned his back on his own kind, and butchered Higgins and their companion in cold blood while they sat at the dinner table. In the inflamed atmosphere of the New Mexico territory, where Apache raids were a constant, terrifying reality, those words were a match dropped into a powder keg. Sitting in the corner of the saloon, nursing a bourbon, was Captain Josiah Sterling. Sterling was a former Texas Ranger with a face like tanned leather and a heart blacker than a coal mine. He commanded a heavily armed, legally sanctioned militia, effectively a brutal vigilante posse paid by the mining companies to keep the trails clear of indigenous threats. Sterling had a personal vendetta against the Apaches. A raid on his ranch 10 years prior had cost him his wife and his left eye, which he now covered with a cracked leather patch. Sterling stood up, his spurs jingling ominously in the sudden silence of the saloon. He walked over to Banning, grabbing the man by his greasy collar. "You swear to this, Banning? Coulter's harboring an Apache?" Sterling growled. "Swear on my mother's grave, Captain," Banning stammered. "He's got a squaw and a pup. Cut Higgins's throat just for looking at him." Sterling dropped the man and turned to the crowd, his one good eye glittering with malice. "Saddle up, boys. We're going bear hunting. Bring plenty of rope. We're going to hang Rowan Coulter from his own roof beam, and we'll collect the bounty on the savages he's hiding." Back at the cabin, Rowan was moving with frantic, agonizing urgency. He knew the mentality of the men in the valley. They wouldn't come to ask questions. They would come to burn him out. "Pack everything you can carry," Rowan told Nalin, tossing her a heavy canvas sack. He began pulling boxes of 44 rimfire cartridges from a hidden floorboard cache, stuffing them into his saddlebags. "Blankets, dried meat, canteens. We have to ride." Nalin moved swiftly, her survival instincts kicking in. "Where do we go?" she asked, tying Dawson's small winter moccasins tightly to his feet. "South," Rowan said, strapping his heavy Colt revolver to his hip and wincing as the leather belt pressed against his bandaged ribs. "Into the Black Range. We're taking you back to your people." Nalin stopped, staring at him. "The Shehen? The Warm Springs Band?" Rowan nodded grimly. "It's the only place Sterling and his mob won't dare follow. It's suicide for a white posse to ride that deep into Apache country." "It is suicide for you, as well," Nalin said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. She stepped close to him, her eyes searching his face. "My people do not welcome white men. They will not ask questions either. They will kill you, Rowan." "I'll take my chances with your chiefs over Josiah Sterling," Rowan replied, reaching out to gently brush a strand of jet-black hair from her cheek. "I'm not leaving you to those wolves, Nalin. I won't." For a long moment, the air between them was thick with unspoken emotions. The frontier had taught them both that attachment was a vulnerability, a liability that usually ended in a shallow grave. But looking at the towering, battered mountain man who was risking the gallows to save her, Nalin felt the heavy walls around her heart crumble completely. She pressed her hand to his cheek. "Then we ride together, until the end." They saddled Rowan's massive buckskin Mustang, Brimstone, and loaded a stubborn pack mule with their remaining supplies. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, bloody shadows across the snowmelt, Rowan took one last look at the log cabin he had built with his own 2 hands. It had been his fortress, his sanctuary from a world that had tried to break him. Now, it was just wood and stone. He struck a match against his boot heel, the sulfur flaring brightly in the dusk. He tossed it onto the oil-soaked rags he had piled on the porch. The flames caught instantly, roaring to life. If Sterling wanted his cabin, he could have the ashes. With Nalin riding behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, and Dawson secured in a makeshift saddle cradle in front, Rowan kicked Brimstone into a hard trot down the perilous, rocky switchbacks. The descent into the valley was the beginning of a desperate race against time. The flight south was a grueling test of endurance. By day, the sun beat down mercilessly as they descended from the timberline into the arid, unforgiving expanse of the Chihuahuan Desert. By night, the temperature plummeted, forcing them to huddle together for warmth in dry arroyos, too afraid of being spotted to light a fire. Rowan was running on sheer willpower. His wound wept blood through the bandages, and a low-grade fever constantly threatened to pull him under. He hid his pain well, but Nalin felt the unnatural heat radiating from his skin and the subtle tremors in his muscles when they rode. On the third night, they made camp deep within the labyrinthine canyons of the Black Range. Rowan sat leaning against a sandstone boulder, his breathing shallow, while Nalin carefully unwrapped his bandages to apply fresh herbs. Dasan was asleep nearby, exhausted from the punishing pace. "You are pushing yourself into the earth," Nalin scolded softly, washing the wound with water from his canteen. "We have to keep moving," Rowan rasped, his eyes scanning the shadowed canyon rim above them. "Sterling has Indian trackers, Navajo, most likely. They can read sign on solid rock. They're gaining on us." Nalin finished retying the bandage and sat beside him, her shoulder pressing against his arm. In the quiet dark, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the territory, the outside world felt a million miles away. "Why did you come to these mountains, Rowan?" she asked quietly. "A man who fights like you, who knows the land like you. You could have been a great chief among your people. Instead, you hide." Rowan stared out into the darkness, the memories rising like bitter smoke. "I didn't want to be a chief. I was a sergeant in the army, down in Mexico. I followed orders from men who wore shiny brass buttons and had never seen a man bleed to death. They ordered us to take a fort at Chapultepec. We slaughtered boys. Cadets, no older than your son, will be in a few years." He swallowed hard, his voice thick with old sorrow. "When I came back, I couldn't look at my own reflection. The mountains. They don't judge. They don't give orders. They just are." Nalin reached out, intertwining her fingers with his. "You carry a heavy spirit. But you are not a bad man, Rowan Coulter. A bad man would have left us to the winter." Rowan turned his head, looking deeply into her dark, resilient eyes. "Nalin, when we get to your people, what happens?" Nalin hesitated. The truth was dangerous, but she owed him nothing less. "My people are the Warm Springs Band, but we are closely tied to the Chokanen. The true danger is not just reaching the territory. It is who commands it." She took a deep breath. "My brother is not just a warrior, Rowan. He is Chief Loco. And he is allied with Mangus Coloradas." Rowan felt the blood drain from his face. Mangus Coloradas and Chief Loco were legends, brilliant, ruthless tacticians who had brought the United States cavalry to a standstill. They commanded hundreds of seasoned warriors. Walking into their camp was like walking into a hornet's nest covered in meat. Well, Rowan managed a grim, tired smile. "I suppose I'll need to make a good impression." Their brief respite ended violently the next morning at a narrow passage known as Skeleton Canyon. They had just entered the rocky defile when the sharp crack of a sharp's rifle shattered the morning silence. A bullet ricocheted off the canyon wall inches from Rowan's head, showering them in stone splinters. "Hiya!" Rowan roared, slapping Brimstone's flanks. The horse bolted forward. The pack mule, stubborn and slow, balked at the gunshot and froze. A second shot rang out, and the mule collapsed, effectively blocking the narrow trail behind them. Rowan spurred Brimstone around a sharp bend in the canyon, dragging the horse to a halt behind an outcropping of jagged limestone. He vaulted out of the saddle, hauling Nalin and Dasan down with him. "Stay low. "Do not move," he ordered, pulling the Henry rifle from its scabbard. Echoing down the canyon came the thunder of hooves and the shouts of men. Captain Sterling and his posse had caught up. There were at least 15 men, heavily armed and thirsty for blood. "Coulter!" Sterling's voice boomed, echoing off the canyon walls. "There's nowhere to run, boy. The canyon boxes out a mile ahead. Send the squaw out and we'll give you a quick hanging." Rowan gritted his teeth. He checked the action of his rifle. 15 rounds. "I'll see you in hell first, Josiah," Rowan yelled back. He leaned around the rock and fired twice. A man in a brown duster was thrown backward off his horse, a .44 slug taking him in the chest. The posse immediately scrambled for cover behind boulders and deadfall, laying down a withering hail of suppressing fire. Lead chewed the rock around Rowan's head, blinding him with dust. "We can't hold them here," Rowan shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire. His wound had torn open again, and he could feel warm blood pooling in his boot. "When I give the word, get on Brimstone. Ride hard down the canyon." "I will not leave you!" Nalin screamed, her eyes blazing with defiance. She pulled Higgins's Colt revolver from Rowan's belt, cocking the hammer with both thumbs. "You have to get Dawson out," Rowan pleaded, his voice breaking. "If they take you, they'll sell you in Mexico. They'll kill the boy. Go." Before Nalin could argue, the posse launched a flanking maneuver. 5 men scrambled up the steep scree slope to their right, seeking higher ground to shoot down into Rowan's position. Rowan pivoted, firing as fast as he could work the Henry's lever. He dropped 2 men, their bodies tumbling down the loose rocks, but the remaining 3 found cover and opened fire. A bullet grazed Rowan's left thigh, knocking his leg out from under him. He hit the dirt hard, his rifle clattering out of reach. Sterling, seeing the mountain man fall, let out a triumphant roar. "Push forward! End him!" The posse broke from cover, advancing down the narrow trail, their weapons raised. Nalin stood over Rowan, aiming the heavy revolver at the charging men, her hands shaking but her resolve ironclad. She was prepared to die fighting. But as Sterling's men closed to within 50 yards, a chilling, unearthly sound echoed from the canyon rim above them. It was a high, undulating wail, the Apache war cry. Sterling stopped dead in his tracks, looking up. The canyon rims, which had been empty seconds before, were suddenly lined with men. Hundreds of Apache warriors, their faces painted in streaks of white and ochre, stood silhouetted against the blinding morning sun. Rifles were leveled, and bows were drawn tight, the obsidian arrowheads aimed squarely down into the gorge. For a second, there was absolute, terrifying silence in Skeleton Canyon. Then, the trap snapped shut. A devastating volley of rifle fire and arrows rained down from the cliffs, explicitly targeting Sterling's men. The posse was caught in a lethal crossfire with no cover. Horses screamed, men fell, and the canyon floor erupted into chaos. Sterling shouted orders, trying to organize a retreat, but an arrow caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him around. The survivors broke and ran, abandoning their dead and scrambling desperately back the way they came. In less than a minute, it was over. The dust settled, revealing a landscape of death that Rowan and Nalin had miraculously survived. Rowan lay on his back, staring up at the sky, his breathing ragged. He expected the warriors to turn their weapons on him next. Instead, a group of 20 riders slowly descended a hidden trail to the canyon floor. At their head rode a man of imposing physical stature, his face deeply lined, wearing a headband of red cloth and carrying a repeating rifle across his lap. It was Chief Loco. The warriors surrounded Rowan and Nalin, their expressions hostile and unreadable. One warrior dismounted, drawing a heavy ironwood war club, and walked toward Rowan, who was too weak to even raise his hands to defend himself. Nalin threw herself over Rowan's body, her arms spread wide, shielding him. "Doodah!" she screamed in Apache, her voice echoing with the authority of a chief's bloodline. "Stop!" Chief Loco rode forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the battered woman, the terrified child, and the bleeding white man beneath her. "Nalin," the chief spoke, his voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. He looked at Rowan, noting the blood, the empty rifle, and the dead posse members down the trail. "You travel with the enemy." "He is not the enemy, brother," Nalin declared, holding the chief's formidable gaze without flinching. "He is the wolf who protected your blood when our own warriors were slaughtered. He bled for me. He bled for Dasan." The warriors murmured among themselves, gripping their weapons tightly. A white man deep in the Dragoon Mountains was unprecedented. To let him live was a violation of every law of war they possessed. Chief Loco sat in silence, his sharp eyes evaluating Rowan, who was fighting simply to stay conscious. The mountain man had brought the chief's sister back from the dead, fighting through his own kind to do it. Chief Loco lowered his repeating rifle. The silence in Skeleton Canyon was heavier than the gunfire had been. He looked from his sister's fierce, tear-streaked face to the bleeding, half-conscious white man beneath her. Loco was a pragmatic leader. He knew the value of loyalty, and he saw the grisly trail of dead bounty hunters Rowan had left behind to protect Apache blood. "Bind his wounds," Loco commanded his warriors in their native tongue, his voice cutting through the dry wind. "Tie him to his horse. If the Great Spirit wishes him to live the journey to Ojo Caliente, he will live. If he dies, we leave him to the buzzards." The journey deep into the San Mateo Mountains was a blur of agony and fever dreams for Rowan. When he finally awoke with a clear mind, he was lying on soft furs inside a spacious wickiup. The scent of burning cedar and roasting piñon nuts filled the air. Nalin was there, as she had always been, grinding corn on a stone metat. Dasan was playing outside, his laughter mingling with the sounds of the bustling Warm Springs encampment. Rowan had survived, but he was a prisoner in paradise. For months, he lived under the heavy, watchful eyes of the Chihen. He learned their language, abandoning English entirely. He proved his worth not with weapons, which he was forbidden to carry, but by working the horse herds and showing the young boys how to track using the subtle displacements of mountain shale. Slowly, the ice thawed. He wasn't Rowan Coulter, the white trapper, anymore. The camp began calling him Nde Bicho, the white bear. But the fragile peace of the mountains was shattered in the autumn of 1865. Apache scouts rode into camp on lathered horses, bringing terrifying news. A massive, combined force of Chihuahua State Militia and ruthless American scalp hunters, numbering over 600 well-armed men, was marching toward the Black Range. Worse, they were dragging 2 Bronze Mountain howitzers. The bounty on Apache scalps had reached record highs, and this army intended to wipe out the Warm Springs Band entirely. Chief Loco convened a council fire. The greatest tacticians of the nation were there. Victorio, a rising war leader, and a fierce, stocky warrior from the Bedonkohe band named Goyacla, who the Mexicans would later curse as Geronimo. They knew their traditional hit-and-run guerrilla tactics would be devastatingly countered by the explosive shrapnel of the howitzers if they were caught in the valley approaches. Loco ordered Rowan to be brought before the council. Rowan stood tall, his beard trimmed, his skin tanned dark by the high desert sun, wearing the buckskin Nalin had sewn for him. "You were a soldier for the Bluecoats," Loco said, his dark eyes boring into Rowan. "You know the minds of these men. You know the thunder guns they drag." Rowan nodded slowly. "I fought with artillery in Mexico. It is slow to turn, but if they set those howitzers on the high ridges overlooking your camp, they will rain fire on your women and children. You cannot fight them in the open." Loco stood, walking to the center of the firelight. He looked at the assembled chiefs, then back to Rowan. "My warriors know the rocks and the wind, but you know the enemy's heart. I will not let my people be slaughtered." Loco pointed a weathered finger directly at Rowan's chest. "I offer you 500 of our finest lances. You will be their war chief for this sun. You will lead them, White Bear. Break their iron guns, or do not return." It was an unprecedented, staggering honor, a white man given command of an Apache army. Rowan looked toward the edge of the circle, where Nalin stood, holding Dasan. His old life was ashes. This was his family now. "I will break them," Rowan vowed. The next dawn, Rowan set his trap at a narrow, steep-walled bottleneck known as Devil's Wash. He didn't paint his face, but he rode Brimstone at the head of 500 warriors. He used his knowledge of military march formations against the militia. He allowed their vanguard to pass, waiting agonizing hours in the sweltering heat until the heavy, horse-drawn howitzers entered the deepest part of the gorge. Then, Rowan gave the signal. It wasn't a skirmish, it was an annihilation. Rowan directed his archers and riflemen to specifically target the artillery horses and the cannon crews first, pinning the massive guns in the mud. Without their heavy support, the cramped militia panicked. Caught in a devastating crossfire, orchestrated by a man who knew exactly how a terrified platoon would react, the scalp hunters broke formation and were slaughtered. Rowan fought fiercely at the front lines, ensuring the artillery was permanently disabled. When the dust settled, the militia was decimated, and the threat to the Warm Springs Band was erased. Rowan returned to Ojo Caliente, not as a guest, but as a legend. That night, under a canopy of blazing desert stars, Chief Loco stood before the tribe and officially bound Rowan and Nalin together in the Apache custom, tying their wrists with a braided leather cord. Rowan Coulter, the solitary mountain man, had finally found his home, forged in blood and bound by a love that conquered the deepest divides of the untamed West. The legend of the White Bear faded into frontier myth, a whispered ghost story around cavalry campfires. History books rarely record the men who vanish into the mountains to find their souls. Rowan and Nalin lived out their days in the rugged high country, their love a quiet defiance against a violent age, proving that even in the most unforgiving wilderness, humanity can survive the winter.
Hi, my name is Ivy Duck Devotion, the owner and manager of Ivy Duck Devotion. After watching the video, Mountain Man saved Apache woman and her child from starvation. Chief offered 500 warriors to him. I really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the quiet courage and kindness shown in a moment when survival was all that mattered. Sometimes people make the biggest difference not because they are powerful, but because they choose to help when they could have walked away. That part of the story really says a lot about loyalty, sacrifice, and the kind of respect that has to be earned through actions. Do you think the mountain man expected anything in return for helping them, or was it simply the right thing to do? And if you were in that situation, would you risk your own safety to protect strangers in need? I think stories like this remind us that even small acts of compassion can completely change someone's life, especially during hard times. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these kinds of mountain man stories and historical survival tales, feel free to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.